Thanks for joining us. So it's Sue Mills and Sarah O'Neill from the Mills team. We're a small but select group today. Everybody else is off doing deals.
Exactly.
So we're so happy to bring you today Jason McGuire, who is the owner of Real Property Management. And our team's had a big focus recently on basically helping our clients move from maybe just owning their principal residence to owning a secondary property, something that they would buy and put tenants in and kind of experience growth over the years. But I think probably the biggest objection or kind of fear that a lot of our clients would have is, I don't want to be a landlord. Everybody's heard the nightmare stories about being a landlord. So that's where Jason can come in to potentially help. So Jason's company basically will manage properties for landlords, and maybe along with telling us a bit about what you do and how you can help, we can just kind of get even into some best practices around what the do's and don'ts of being a landlord. But why don't you first tell us a little bit about your company and what services you can offer to help these potential terrified landlords out there.
For sure. Well, being a landlord is a journey. And so we in a property management office are here to help landlords treat their properties as investments. So we are here to guide your property down the right path through your tenant selection, placement, management of your asset, and your monthly routine tasks that happen with your property. So your small things from rent collection straight up to eviction orders that come out of it, and really managing the maintenance of the asset. Because much like a car, a lot of people don't think investment properties need regular work and maintenance on it. So we build out customized schedules to make sure that properties maintain in good shape.
Mm-hmm. So can you describe for us sort of your ideal client?
Yeah, our typical client owns 1.3 units, lives within 8 kilometers of the property that we manage, and really wants to grow a real estate portfolio. So they're typically their first-time intentional investors, stepping into this space. We have a lot of guidance. It's helping people educate on what it means to be a landlord and how we help them focus on being an investor as opposed to a landlord.
Mm-hmm.
And that's because you let it be a more passive investment, because you're taking a lot of the day-to-day work out of being a landlord, dealing with the tenants themselves, the maintenance issues, any potential problems, and it just allows it more to be a passive investment. Is that kind of the concept?
It's truly the way that we put ourselves in between the landlord and the tenant. In our typical process, the tenant never gets to meet the landlord.
Okay,
they don't talk, they don't communicate. And then when anything that comes up arises, our office is the first point of contact. Okay. And so we're here to resolve those issues or questions on the landlord's behalf. And then we reach out when there's important decisions or things that involve costs that might need to be arranged too. So it really helps them focus on being an investor instead of worrying about complaining tenants or leaking toilets. Because their time is typically better spent in other areas.
And what type of fees do you charge for that service? How does the payment work?
Yeah, so we have management plans ranging anywhere from 6.9% of the rent up to 11.9%.
Of the annual rent.
Yeah, the annual collected rent for a property.
Right.
So they obviously scale with what the investments are. And obviously we have some caps and some minimums as well, too, to make sure that we're always within the marketplace offerings. We do have additional services for placing tenants and screening, as we find that the onboarding process is probably the most involved and most critical. As if you don't find the right people and you don't find the right expectations are set, everything else just kind of spirals from there sometimes.
Right. So that tenant screening process is sort of 99% of the battle, I guess, in terms of just getting those right tenants. So can you walk us through sort of that process and how you go about identifying the best tenant for a landlord?
Yeah, I'd love to. We talk tenants all the time.
Yeah.
So tenant selection really is about navigating typically a minefield. When we talk about what makes good tenants, we typically come down to 3 criteria that we want to make sure always match up and are top of mind. So 1, does the tenant story make sense? So what is it they're coming to you? They're telling you they're going to move. Why are they moving? Does it match up with the paperwork? Does it match up with the landlord? Does it make sense in your gut? Or does something kind of feel off? And that's a fun one to document, as you could imagine. Next we like to talk about how they are affordability-wise and stability. So, does this property fit nicely into a place where they think they could manage living there? Is it going to be managing with the expectations going forward? You know, we're in a marketplace now where a lot of new condominiums have multiple $100s of rent increases year over year.
Right.
Are we planning for a scenario where we want a tenant to vacate in a year? Or is it talking about more of a long term? And obviously, there's pros and cons to each of them. And the last one I'd say is really the reference checks. And it's not so much about performing the reference checks, it's about understanding who you're actually talking to. And I love this little scenario, so I'm going to ask you it. You know, say you had a terrible tenant. Absolutely hate them. Monthly get out, owe you thousands of dollars. And I call you up for reference. What are you going to tell me about this tenant?
For sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah, if they're my current tenant, or well, not I wouldn't do that. But no, it's funny. My dad, who's been in real estate forever, 92 years old, and has owned lots of investment properties, and that's what he always said. You don't talk to the current landlord, you talk to the previous landlord who doesn't have a reason to try to get the current guy out.
For sure. And that's just it. You're going to tell me all wonderful things to get this problem not to be yours. So just like any other reference you're calling, whether it be for job or landlord, you always have to understand who it is you're speaking to and what it is you're asking them. You know, it's so easy to forge and edit digital documents these days, and people rely on them too much.
Yeah, that's interesting because I think what we've found over the years is the single biggest thing, just even in personally, the investment properties we've owned, is that the credit check, the credit score, if it's a legitimate credit score that you're getting, to me tells a lot about a person. Like if they pay their bills regularly, like it's incredible how much that says about a person. And anyone we've ever had in a property that's had a good credit score, we've never had a single problem with them. But the ones that sometimes you try to be nice and you try to do the right thing and you want to give somebody a break and they've had all kinds of reasons, as you say, the story, why this, and this. And you want to be nice, but sometimes that's the one that backfires on you.
It typically tends to be. In those situations, we find it's more the landlord's not able to separate the business aspect of owning a rental property and the personal aspect of getting involved with these human beings.
Right.
You know, there are a lot of stories out there. Most of them are going to be true. But these are the stories that you as an investor want to get involved in. Do you want to bring this extra complication into your place of business? You know, typically, I would advise you to avoid it. You know, it's not going to say they're not going to be great tenants, but are these extra things that you are prepared to take on to, which you'll never get compensated for?
What would happen if, you might probably going to ask the same question you guys.
No, go ahead.
So I was just going to say, what would happen if you onboard a tenant and everything looks great and then something happens, either their situation changes or, you know, something was misleading right from the start and they actually stop paying the rent? Can your firm help out the landlords in any way? Or how does that work? If a tenant stops paying rent, is your primary focus at that point just getting them out in the proper legal ways, or is there any kind of financial way that your firm would give relief to a landlord?
Yeah, so I'd say a lot packed into that question.
Sorry.
Yeah, I like that part of the question. That was good. Yeah.
You know, dealing with tenant non-payment of rent is very typical. You know, any office you visit will probably have, you know, a 20% delinquency rate on the second of the month, where there's just always going to be a few stragglers who don't come in. You get to know who they are. And there's always just going to be a few other people who are surprised that when something comes up. You know, you didn't expect them to be late in their rent. And where the scenario goes from there is different every time. But where I say in our office, it always starts with a conversation. You know, if you can find out what the difficulty is, you can save yourself hours of work chasing something down that might not even be a possibility. And also a simple phone call will tell you, hey, is the rent going to come in a couple days? Do I need to send a notice of eviction? Can we make an arrangement that would be far quicker than an eviction? Or am I just going to be chasing you down and better start my paperwork in the meantime until we have an answer? So we could walk a little bit down some of those different avenues if you like. But a lot of the nice things that have changed recently in the Residential Tenancy Act is the ability to negotiate a payment plan that's enforceable by the board. Because your options prior to the changes in Bill 184 were really, here's my notice to evict you, or we come to an agreement, and if it doesn't work out, then I'll serve you a notice to evict you. And timelines for hearings were terrible before COVID, and they only got worse.
Got worse, right. That's interesting. I didn't realize that there was now, through the act, that you could actually have the payment plan. So how does that work? Or again, is it based on the scenario?
Yeah, so the payment plan still has to be an agreement between you and your tenant. And something like this Typically did happen at the board through a mediator before, where they try and get everybody to go before you hit the adjudicator.
Right.
Because anything that the two of you can agree to is typically going to be better than what the adjudicator will award in a timeline-wise.
Right.
So if your tenant's open or if they're having some challenges, I would typically advise you to be flexible in communicating with them. If your rent's going to be 10 days late, but you can get it, it's going to be better than any other scenario.
Right. And we saw a bit of that during COVID where, people were trying to get out of leases and, we're having problems paying their rent. And when we got those calls, we were always saying, just call the landlord, be upfront, try and negotiate, a way to make this all work. And, I agree, a conversation is always better than just going down a legal path right away, for sure. And we're talking a lot about negative things. I mean, there's so many amazing rental stories. Like we have a great client who he's had condo investment properties for years. And he has a few of his tenants that have literally been in there for 13 years. He never hears from them. The rent comes in. He doesn't even have to ask them. It's just amazing. So, I mean, I love those stories, especially because everyone can hear the bad story, and that's what scares people. But there are many, many great stories, and I'm sure with you guys too. I mean, you probably have, a great success rate because of the fact that you have, a process, a very defined process around how to keep track of everything and ensure the tenants are paying and the property's being kept up to date. And on that note, can you talk to us about how often you can check in on the tenant or the suite itself? Because there are rules around that through the Act. So can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, the rules in the Act about checking on a property really just say don't harass your tenant. So they're really vague there.
Okay.
The rules, though, really more apply about how you gain entry into the units. So you could go to your unit every day. It's physically possible. You'd get sued, but it's physically possible.
Yeah. I thought it had to be emergency or,
That's without notice.
Okay.
But, typically what I advise people, depending on the type of asset, should determine how often you're going to check it out. So if we're talking like a condominium apartment, 1 to 2 checks a year is typically what you need, unless you find there's either a problem or an issue with a tenant. That's normally enough for you to go in, take a look around, perform your normal service items in the unit to make sure it's being kept up. When you get into more of the small multi-res, 6 or less units, typically we recommend 3 to 4 times a year.
Wow.
But there tends to be more seasonal work involved. For example, you'd go in the winter and you winterize the property. You come out in the summer, maybe you want to go with fertilizing the lawn.
Right.
And if you're going to go out to the property to do a visit, you might as well check on it anyway.
Right.
Because you're already there.
And if you've got a furnace or an air conditioner, you probably want to get that serviced twice a year. You could attend with the technicians. And kind of on that physical part of the property, is that something that, because I think people are fearful about, kind of tenants, and then the second thing is just fearful about the physical maintenance of the property. So is that something that your firm can help? Everybody's afraid of getting the phone call at 3 a.m. that the toilet's backed up. So is your company kind of a 24/7 helpline, or what happens if there's that kind of a toilet backup at 3 a.m.?
Yeah, everybody loves that example.
I know. Sorry, I should have been more original than that.
So those aren't typically the problems that you do tackle with, but yeah, they do come up. And we do have emergency services for scenarios like that, where we typically find that most small or new investors really shy away from solution is really properly planning out how to take care of the home. When you live in your own house, you just change the furnace filter, you don't think about it. You book services when you notice a problem. And a lot of tenants are really good at reporting them, some are not. But a lot of tenants won't report to you like routine items. I could probably count on my hand the number of times a tenant has called me up and say you need to clean the eaves.
Right.
Because it's just not something that they look at as part of their rental.
Right.
They're not responsible for maintenance of the unit. But they'll typically only reach out when a problem's got so big or so irritating to them that it needs to be solved. Which is why I typically promote going into checking out the units yourselves. You'll pay more attention, you'll look for different things, and you can resolve a lot of things before they become problems. So if we go back to the condominium apartment, if you're in there changing out the batteries in your thermostat once a year, the odds of it breaking are very little.
Right.
But if you've never done it and suddenly the heat goes out, you've got a couple $100 call for a HVAC company to come out in the middle of the night or something. And if they go there to change a AA, you're going to be sitting there going, oh, because it's happened.
So you're giving, I assume, I liked your sort of analogy that it's sort of like a car maintenance schedule. You're basically setting up a schedule with the tenant from sort of the beginning of the lease period to say when you'll be going in or how often you'll go in. Do you actually establish that up front? Or do they know that, or how do you actually communicate that?
Yeah, so our conversations actually start with a real estate investor about how would you like to manage your asset. And then we come up with a plan seasonally for about what type of maintenance work we think is needed at a property like yours. And then, we very much arrange with handyman to go out to the property and perform those services.
Okay.
That information is communicated in advance with tenants and is typically booked around their schedules to make them very easy to facilitate these sort of processes.
And that's part of your fee. Sorry, not to cut you off. Is that's part of your fee? So that's part of the percent that you take annually from the landlord.
Yeah, so our organization, our planning of it all they actually just pay for the maintenance work that takes place.
Okay, so if there is maintenance required, they pay for that as well.
Yeah, so if
sense.
they have to go out and change a set of taps, for example, they're paying for that cost.
Okay, yeah, that seems fair. And just because a lot of our clients are, as we mentioned earlier, they're single, buying their first rental property and are just worried about being a landlord. One of the questions we get, even from our existing clients, if they have a tenant in place at their income property now and they want to sell it, they're under the assumption they can just tell them they're selling it, so they have to leave. Can you speak about that when you get those calls from maybe an investor client who says they want to sell their property and how they have to handle the tenant?
Sure. So not very uncommon. A lot of people just think they can give 60 days notice and you can end the lease.
Right.
But there's no actual provision in the Residential Tenancy Act to sell a property for it to be for an end user. What actually needs to happen is you can come to an agreement with the tenant using an N11 to end a lease, or the buyer can serve an N12 notice to end the lease and move into the unit, either them, their immediate family, or a caregiver.
Right.
And the N12 process, it's been in the news quite a lot recently.
Yeah.
Because that process changed quite a bit because of the number of bad faith applications, where a lot of landlords or small-time investors are starting to get sued from serving them improperly. So they now come with a 12-month follow-up to make sure you followed with that commitment, a payment to the tenant of 1 month's rent for their troubles of vacating,
right,
and of course penalties if you don't follow through with it.
Right.
What we do find though most of the time is you sell a property with a tenant, you have a great realtor who does it, and they make sure these things don't become problems,
right,
because they know what those minefields are.
And do you find it's often difficult to get, if a property is being sold and it's likely going to be an N11 if somebody is going to move into it for their own personal use, is it hard to get tenants kind of on board to cooperate with showings and stuff, showing appointments to prospective buyers, or how do you kind of handle that situation?
Yeah, I think it all comes down to setting expectations. A landlord or a realtor or a showing can show a property anytime if they give 24 hours written notice, hand delivered to a property, or if they've signed up for email consent, emailed in advance. But, I don't think that happens, and at least in my experience, most of the time. What happens, a great realtor will negotiate with a tenant to come up with a resolution that everybody's happy with.
Yeah.
If you're going to have 60 people come into a property for a night, if you don't talk to your tenant, they're not going to be happy about it.
No, that's for sure.
Yeah,
it's really logical, isn't it?
Right. Sometimes we've done things like just treat people well. We've paid tenants for every showing or something just so that they can have some incentive
for coffee.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Sometimes if you really think it's going to be a busy time, have the tenant go to a hotel for the weekend or something like that. So there's ways, and sometimes too, if it may not be a family wanting to move in for themselves. It may just be another investor. And if they can see that there's a great tenant in place who's allowing the showings and the place is kept nicely, it can be a real asset to have the prospective buyer see the tenant that's actually there and being a great tenant. And as most tenants are great tenants. Most people
That's
are
right.
great people. I think we hear their horror stories all the time, but they really are, at least in our experience, they're the minority, not the majority for sure.
They are, and where I think I see the most difficulty in that is people just don't have great records to represent how tenants have taken care of their property. Most small-time investors don't even have a ledger to prove when rent was paid or not.
Right.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I think you would probably agree that most single-family homes in the Toronto area typically are end user geared when they go for their advertising.
Right.
Right.
You know, it's not until you kind of step up into that sort of multi or secondary unit do people really start saying, okay, this is an asset. You know, I want to have a tenant in there. I want it producing income from day one instead of having, 30 days empty to find a new tenant.
Right.
Can you tell us a little bit about kind of what's allowed in terms of giving annual rent increases, or I think there's a difference in how old or how new the building is, what you can do, how often you can give a rent increase, and how much you can increase the rents?
For sure. So you can only increase the rent one time a year. It doesn't matter what type of property it is. And then you basically have two separate classes for either rent controlled or not. So if you're not rent controlled, which is after November, it's 15th or 18th of 2018, we'll look it up, I don't remember the exact date, you don't have any rent control. So you can increase the rent any amount you want. It could be $100, it could be $1,000.
Right.
Also a nice strategy, get rid of a bad tenant sometimes. If you are before that date where the unit hasn't been existed or technically never used for rental purposes, really hard to prove, you are locked into what the government rent increase guidelines are. And they have a maximum cap of, I believe it is 3%. And they fluctuate per year.
Every year.
Yeah, every year they establish it. Yeah.
Yeah, so every year they put out a guideline in the summer months. And that's what it is for the year going forward. Most small landlords, should understand you have to pay tenant interest on your last month's rent deposit. But you only have to pay what the guideline says. So if you're an exempt property and you raise the rent $200, but you only have to pay 1.2% interest, make sure you're only cutting that $50 check and not giving them credit for the $200.
And when it's time for those rent increase notices, if you're managing the property for somebody, do you basically just have it diarized and every year you have a conversation with the landlord and say, do you want to raise the rent? And if so, we have to give 90 days notice. So this is the day we need to post date to do it, or?
So with the rent control properties, the increases just go out. It's not even a conversation.
Okay.
Oh.
Your expenses go up. There's no reason you shouldn't try and recapture some of that through increased rents. For the above guideline increased properties, not rent controlled, those are typically a conversation piece because you've got where exactly does the market rent fall for the unit.
Right.
As you know, there's a little bit of a range that comes into play. And then what happens when you give that notice to your tenant? They typically have three different options that can't be resolved by notice. Are they going to stay there and accept the new rent? Are they just going to leave? Or are they going to try for something in between?
Right.
So you can only plan your actions so far, and a lot of that will come down to where you want to go after you hear back from your tenant. Do you want to find a whole new tenant over $50 a month or $600 a year?
Right.
Probably not worth it. Even a little vacancy period just eats that up.
Right.
So, it does kind of give tenants a little bit of power to try and stay, but it's like anything else, it's a business decision.
What's your experience or recommendation, I should say, around, you get a new tenant, signing a 1-year lease, or do you recommend, were you going to say a question? Great minds. Or do you recommend a longer lease term? What's your sort of experience and knowledge say about that? It should be 1 year or more.
Yeah, so lease terms don't have much of a benefit for the landlord or investor. Tenants can always give 60 days notice to vacate a property. So normally by locking yourself into a longer term lease, you prevent yourself from having actions about how to evict the tenant.
Right.
So you can't evict them for owner possession, late payment of rent, renovations to the unit if it happens to be required, are all items that are taken off of your tool belt when you're locked into a lease term.
So to recap, 1 year is your best strategy.
I would love to say no year, but the marketplace really demands 1 year.
Right.
And then to go month to month after that, just automatically month to month after that, never to renew for, a longer period than after that first year.
Yeah, so all leases in Ontario go month to month after the initial term.
Right.
And I would recommend don't sign back into a lease term. We do see some tenants asking for it. I guess they're just used to it, or they come from another area where it's kind of a requirement. Because there are fixed term leases even in other provinces where you have to vacate at the end, just not in Ontario.
So can I just clarify one thing you said? You said tenants can always leave with 60 days notice, but that's just from the end of the lease term, right? Like if no, is that right?
No?
Tenant can leave any time with 60 days
Are
notice.
you serious?
Really? Even if they have a 1 year lease, they can leave?
I actually didn't realize that. I thought
Wow.
that the landlord and the tenant were both obligated to the term of the first lease, and then just at the end of that lease, either could give 60 days notice.
No, the only thing that has really changed there recently is, again, with Bill 184, is that now if you suffer damages from that tenant leaving, you can pursue them for it. Where in the past, you didn't have those opportunities or options.
So if you can't re-rent it, if they give you 60 days notice and there's 6 months left on the lease and you can't re-rent it, you could go after them if they've signed the 1-year lease.
Yeah, so you would go with lost rent, additional costs to advertise a unit, repairs to the unit for when they were staying there beyond wear and tear, are all things we typically see happen now with these new changes.
So the 1-year lease really just protects the tenant, not to the landlord. Interesting.
So interesting.
I think maybe sometimes people want a 1-year lease because sometimes it's kind of the market rent is to pay a 1 month's rent to a professional who finds a tenant for you. So that may be partly why people are in the habit of making sure that they've got a year-long tenant. But interesting.
Well, laws have changed with years, and practices don't always change to align with them.
Right.
I know, and like you said, the 1-year lease term has just become pretty common throughout Ontario from what I've seen.
Isn't it great? I know. I love this. Every day learning something new. So just to backtrack a little bit, so we talked about how important the screening process for the tenant. How do you typically market a property that is, in your portfolio? So it comes up for rent. How do you guys go about marketing, and what are some of your tips for that?
Yeah, so marketing is normally done directly to consumer. Okay. So we work with a lot of rental listing sites or internet listing services. Think of things, like your PadMapper, your Zumper. We don't really use Kijiji, but those type of things that target tenants directly. Mm-hmm. And then we also have a professionals channel that we work as well too, with realtors, relocation companies, hospitality services, because we really want to appeal to the widest audience possible.
Right.
When you're actually working to your ad of the property, I tell you, be very careful on the language of the people that you're trying to work with. This goes back to human rights into landlords and how it affects you. So you don't have a family home. You don't have it in an area that's great for kids. You don't talk about the people who are going to be using it. You talk about the property itself. Just like we no longer have a master bedroom, it's a primary.
Right.
So you speak to the benefits of what the unit is and the location, and you'll keep yourself clear from most problems. And then you'll also find that you can tweak the way that you're looking for your target tenant by talking more about the benefits that might appeal to who your ideal client is. You're not going to talk about a 1-bedroom condominium the same way you're going to a 4-bedroom house. And without specifying who's going to live there, you can talk more about what those advantages are to appeal to that type of audience.
It's great to have an avenue to take some of that fear away from potential property investors, just to have a company like you that for basically, I think you're saying kind of roughly 10% or so a year, and it sounds like it's a bit of a sliding scale there, but for a certain percentage of your rent, you can kind of have what we call a passive investment, and you can sleep at night and not worry, and somebody will get a great tenant for you, and they'll take care of the maintenance of the property, and if you have any issues with the tenant, then somebody who's just got that knowledge and experience to deal with it logically and nicely, not make a mountain out of a molehill, and kind of and come up with a logical solution for people.
Well, thank you. I think that was very well put. We're really here to make sure that people can focus on being investors and not landlords.
Right.
Where's your time better spent?
That was great. Thank you. We definitely learned some things. That was fantastic.
So thanks so much for joining us. That's really helpful. And thanks to you for joining us. And if you have any questions, always, we're obviously big supporters of people owning real estate, and when possible, owning a second property or third property. And from personal experience, we've just, I say, you hear all the nightmares. We've had amazing tenants. You do your homework up front and get great. Most people are great. You just get great people in your property, and they help you pay your mortgage, and your property appreciates while you own it. It's just, it's a very sweet thing. So anyways, but thanks for being an avenue to help make it easy for people.
Absolutely.
So anyways, feel free to reach out to us, team at themillsteam.ca, or pick up the phone and give us a call if we can help in any way. So thanks so much.
Thanks.